So, from babies to skeletons. I grew up in the 1980s, and I grew up really with fighting fantasy novels, the set that were brought into being by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. For those of you who don't know what these are, which is probably only a small percentage of the audience, these are a combination of kind of adventure fantasy books. The main thing about them is they present you as the hero adventurer on some kind of thrilling story. You make choices, you save people, you get to punch quite a lot of strange animals and beasts along the way, and hopefully, somewhere along the line, you save the day in whatever form that takes. But there's also quite a lot of ways to die. There's quite a lot of ways for your adventure to end. I like them a lot. I'm sure a lot of people like them a lot for the same reasons, because they gave you a sense of agency in terms of what you were doing. They kind of made you feel like you had some choices on your hero's path through the world. You weren't just reading passively. I got older. I put away semi-childish things. I started learning about science and technology and innovation and the social and the political and the economic sides of it. I started doing work with governments and with universities and all sorts of bodies around the place and in between. And realised slightly to my horror quite recently that the fighting fantasy world actually bears an awful lot of resemblance to the way and the stories that get told through policymaking, particularly around science, technology, and entrepreneurship. This isn't, I think, I'm mostly sure, because policy around science and technology gets made in the Department of Business and Innovation and Skills or at Number 10 or in the White House by various ministers and civil servants sitting down with 2 dice and a notebook and frantically trying to read a book while getting their fingers wedged in the pages to try and figure out which pathways they should be taking. But I can't be 100% sure of that one, given some recent decisions. But what I can say is that the worlds that get built in science and technology policy bear a kind of odd and uncanny resemblance to a lot of what Jackson and Livingstone wrote about. City of Thieves was one of my favourites, and it's actually almost one of the less violent stories, although it still has this hero's path. It's set in this world where the merchants of Silvertown call you as your adventurer to say, we've got problems. There's an evil skeleton lord who lives over in Port Blacksand who wants to basically come over and take over our village. And there's a kind of a minor subplot about if he really wants to come and steal away someone's daughter in the standard kind of saving the maiden way. But it's actually quite a capitalist story. The intro is set up around you being brought in to save these very rich merchants who have a very nice life from this skeleton over there. And they're going to reward you, and they will reward you with very nice and shiny things themselves. Zan Babone, the skeleton, he's terrifying, he's menacing, he has moon dogs who have razor-sharp fangs, and he needs to be defeated. And that's where you come in. So this story, again, has kind of echoes in some of the big stories that have been influential in changing the ways that technologies have come into being, a lot of which have been set in play by economists and policymakers over the past 70 years or so. Okay. Now, the first of these stories start around the time of the Second World War, and just afterwards, when a bunch of Austrian economists started looking back at the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, at the economic mess at the end of the 2 wars, at the stagflation that they'd seen, at the bank collapses, and they were thinking, well, this has been terrible. How can we prevent this from happening again? What kind of policies or futures can we point towards that would stop this from happening? And the conclusion that they had come to was that what had led to a lot of these problems had been a particularly heavy-handed state, this thing that had been clamping down and causing more problems than it had really needed to. And what was needed instead was a way of kind of bringing change and growth into an economic system, but without the heavy-handed state itself. The way they thought that could be done was through entrepreneurship. The hero idea of this entrepreneur started to emerge from the 30s and 40s onwards, but really kind of came into form in the 70s itself. This wasn't just the Austrians themselves. This was a bunch of economists of Polanyi, Hayek, Schumpeter, later Milton Friedman, but who all kind of built this idea, this hero myth, of the amazing entrepreneur who would be there to kind of introduce change, save the world. And it really was. It was a heroic narrative. Robert Maynard Keynes even came on board to say that, entrepreneurs were filled with these amazing kind of animal spirits. They would take great risks under conditions of extreme adversity. They would innovate even when conventional economic analysis said that the gambles are too wise. They would leap over that cliff. They would be there. They would be fighting at the front. And this is a very seductive narrative of the kind of a hero entrepreneur who will bring innovation and change. And in the growing of this myth, the words entrepreneurship and innovation and innovative and almost creative as well started collapsing in on each other as well. So you have the entrepreneur who makes new things, who's innovative, who brings innovations into the world in a bit of a messy way that is kind of ill-defined. It was a policy and an idea that picked up steam, particularly during the 80s. Again, it was this very seductive idea that you could have this fantastic new world simply by these heroes who would come through and ride on through and bring change with them. Brilliant. And it's something that persists today, even in the way that business gets taught, even in the language that we see through a lot of science and technology communities about the need to be entrepreneurial, the need to be innovative. And there's a problem here, because sometimes stories themselves don't actually come true. Academics at Sussex, Paul Nightingale and Alex Coade, have, like many contemporary economists, have kind of raised an eyebrow at this myth-making around the entrepreneur, and they decided to crunch through the numbers in the UK and see what they came up with instead. In innovation policymaking, you get quite a lot of kind of drawing on animal myths almost, not just the animal spirits themselves and the entrepreneurs, but you get talk of small firms that grow quickly are gazelles, they leap. And firms that grow big and are powerful and strong are gorillas. And this is the language that gets used in policy documents. And continuing with that, Nightingale and Coade, when they crunched the numbers, said, yeah, we've kind of got a problem here. We haven't really got gazelles, and we haven't really got gorillas. If you look at what makes up most of the market in the UK, it's Muppets. It's marginal, undersized, poor-performing enterprises. So these what we would call, entrepreneurial firms or startups and entrepreneurial businesses in the UK. They're small, they're marginal, they're underperforming, they perform more poorly than other, compared to other types of firms themselves. They're less innovative. It's not a happy story. Now, the people who start these firms, the British entrepreneurs, are happier, and that's good. It's a kind of, again, the agency of working for yourself is fantastic, but that's not the story that we've been sold here about how they're going to save the economy and it's all going to be magic. Happiness is not going to do that. There's something else going on here itself. So the example that Coade and Nightingale give is a fish and chip shop. They say you want the classic, the most common type, of entrepreneurial business in the UK is a fish and chip shop. It's something that was set up most likely by someone who is unemployed and with their money as, again, a way of kind of creating a business for themselves. It will likely set up in a town where there's already a fish and chip shop and there isn't really enough of a market to support another one. So either that shop will go out of business or it will displace the other one. They will both go out of business themselves. So the story is not necessarily true. And this is very recent work, so it's still kind of what influence this has on policymaking is unsure. But the language lives on. The stories themselves become real. And particularly, the stories themselves are very, very heavily coloured by the stories that come out of California, the Apples, the Googles, the Facebooks, the things that could be seen in that way, the Silicon Valley, the Silicon word that gets reflected everywhere like some kind of charm. So we've got problems as well when we start believing the myths in other places as well. Now, there is certainly more so in the Bay Area, far more so than in the UK, an awful lot of money swimming around for those who would be in startups, who would want to, again, create these innovations, who would be these entrepreneurs and go forward into the world themselves. It's an uneven process. A lot of this money is swimming towards the kind of the founder teams and towards then the people they bring into them who are of a particular demographic. And as we heard in the last talk, a lot of that particular demographic is young white men who are often straight out of college and are simply, are taking up these huge and terrifying salaries, these large amounts of money to make, things that they will on this entrepreneurial gene that they will change the world in some way, and everyone will get rich and everyone will be happy. And weird stuff starts to happen here. Weird stuff. Firstly, when you've got these kind of homogenous teams of people who are all quite similar, who, due to some kind of insidious idea of culture fit, are not particularly happy or willing to bring in people who are not like them, and when every one of you is all the same, that's quite a low bar to be setting for yourself. So the kind of technologies that get made are not necessarily very exciting. They're representative of the kind of things that this demographic would want, or that they kind of project out to some other demographic needing, but without that direct, experience and world sense. So you get a lot of kind of little digital things, a lot of kind of dating apps, a lot of kind of places where you can find a restaurant, a lot of things where, you might be able to, track things or, track a place to go to take a date to a restaurant or something like that itself. It's something that Adam Madrigal of The Atlantic said, these technologies that are coming out of these startups, they're nice, they're cheap, they're fun, and they're about as world-changing as another variation of beer pong. This is not, big radical change. But the belief in it can create change in other ways, and the kind of the systems around the Bay Area, in response to this swell of money going into this particular demographic, again, weird things start happening themselves. Ellen Cushing described this change process as something turning into the bacon-wrapped economy, where you've got a lot of service provision that starts rising up to support the needs of these people, these young men who are making a lot of money very quickly and at low risk. Remember, not the kind of a hero jumping over some terrible canyon, but someone who, if they lose their job tomorrow, their company goes down tomorrow, there's likely to be more money. That's all right. So you've got things like fancy restaurants, but fancy restaurants serving things like fried chicken at $48 a plate. You've got things like high-end whiskey tasting. You've got things like being able to rent fast cars very easily. You've got things like clothing companies that spun up selling types of essentially tracksuit bottoms so that you can wear them to work and, not have to be too smart. But, sometimes some of the tracksuit bottoms have got reflective panels on the bottom so you can roll them up and go cycling. And some of them are a little fancier. They're dress pants. They're dress tracksuit bottoms if you need to be a little bit smarter at the office one day. So there's this weird kind of lock-in to this space in terms of who's there, what's they're making, the world, the bubble that surrounds them. But this wouldn't really be happening if there wasn't any money coming into the system, and that, the funding stream as well, starts to lay on weird problems too. If it's not friends or families, a lot of the money can also come from venture capitalists themselves. And venture capitalists are not, do not exist out of the world. They exist very much in it. Funding and financing is incredibly risky. Most innovations fail. You will most likely die on the journey. You will most likely get, eaten by something. And so venture capitalists, as much as anyone else, they know that most of the ventures they fund will fail in some way. So they try and, again, dampen down the risks to make this into something, as low risk, as less dangerous as possible. So part of this is looking to their own experience in ways that kind of seem to make sense. So venture capitalists who have background experience in large firms tend to fund teams that have a person in them with a background from a large firm. Venture capitalists with a background in small firms tend to fund teams which have in them people with a background in a small firm. Venture capitalists with engineering backgrounds tend to fund teams which have in them someone with an engineering background. So there's this kind of this mirroring effect. But the mirroring effect itself also kind of takes itself into the culture, that there's a certain way that entrepreneurs and startup kids are meant to present themselves as they go to meet the VCs, which shows them it's almost like dating. You're not coming across as too arrogant and too cocky, but you're making an appearance, you're making an effort, and you're trying to kind of reflect in the venture capitalist's eyes something that they want to see. So if you're meeting a VC who comes from a mergers and acquisitions background, the general advice is, wear a tie. They like that. But on the other hand, if you're maybe meeting a VC from a more European background, you don't want to be too smart because that just looks like you're trying too hard. That's like turning up on the first day in a full suit and tie, and it's just really off-putting. If you're a girl in these teams, if you're a woman there, and there are some, then Forbes advises you when you go to meet VCs, if you want to, you can wear a pop of colour, like maybe an orange blouse or a pink skirt, and that will give them, the VCs, something to remember when you've left the meeting, but not during the meeting. You don't want to turn up as some kind of multicoloured freak, but just a little kind of like something on the retina to go, oh yeah, okay, we like that. What this does is ends up creating this incredibly weird hall of mirrors effect in terms of what gets funded, where the funders look into the startups, and the startups look into the funders, and down they go, and down they go, and down they go, until you get to a situation where you have Paul Graham from Y Combinator saying, I can be fooled by anyone who looks like Mark Zuckerberg. We once funded a guy, and he was terrible, but I said, how can he be bad? He looks like Zuckerberg. Money, a lot of money here, kids. There's also things which are very, very difficult to get funding for, even, outside of this little bubble, sort of things that are untouchable, that even if the technology or the idea is good and money-making, it's just they will not get funded themselves. Mostly, this is anything to do with sex. Pornography itself doesn't really get VC funding. It never really has. And it's odd because this is one of an industries that is very hyped up as being highly profitable. It kind of isn't, not anymore, but it's still, you'd think, given the kind of dross that does get funded, you think, well, maybe it's a money game, but it's really not. It's about the kind of the social reputation as much as anything else of what gets funded. So porn companies don't get funded. Again, there's financial elements to it as well. They don't tend to have good exit strategies, but that again comes back. Yeah, but that comes back to who would buy them. Who would buy them? Who would put their reputation on the line to do that? VCs themselves, even if the VC thinks, brilliant idea, lots of money, cracking, they then have to go back to their boards and say, I did that with your money, I funded that, that's what I did. And VCs are not willing to take that risk at all. And that's even the interesting mirroring comes down to clothing itself. There's this kind of idea that pornographers, are those in fantastic kind of long leopard skin jackets, or just very scruffy guys in, cut-offs and T-shirts, which is not really true at all if it ever was, but there's that idea there. So much so that a financier who spoke to Gawker said, well, maybe pornographers would get funding if they just dressed up a bit and wore nice blue blazers. That might be good. But so this world exists where certain things, the market kind of skews in this way that's shaped by so many social and political and cultural forces. And actually, for all of this, the state has been waiting behind the screen, and it's still there. So, despite all the kind of the rhetoric of hurrah entrepreneurship and throw it to the markets, actually the state has funded an awful lot of technologies that are currently in play now and have made a lot of money and have become pervasive and very influential and in some cases very controlling as well. Mariana Mazzucato is an economist, and her thesis is basically the entrepreneurial state. She's done this incredible historic economic analysis where she pins back various technologies and their original funding to their source and says, actually, look at this, look at this. If you look at the iPhone, for example, the modern one, look at where the original funding from the internet came from. Look at where the original funding for touchscreen came from. Look at where the original funding for voice-activated technology came from. Look at all of that. And you will find that back down the line, there was either basic funding from the state or applied funding from the state or even some seed funding from the state itself in a kind of a fast capital type way. So there has been a role where the state itself has come in to bear the risks that the market, the amazing kind of, hurrah free market, actually hasn't been able to cope with. And there's still a politics at play about what will get funded. Science policy, it's the politics, as the name itself suggests. It's not just a case that things get money thrown at them and, sent out in the world. In policymaking, there's this idea of picking winners, which has kind of fallen out of favour because of how obvious it seemed. And it's literally what it sounds like, that governments would say, well, okay, so that green energy, we will target a lot of money of that. We will fund a lot of students to go and look at it. We will fund a lot of research labs. Or maybe car manufacturing, we will fund that. We will pick those winners. And it has fallen out of favour because it's so obvious. But at the same time, it started to kind of gently rise back in the past few years, this idea that actually the markets might not be able to kind of do that. That might have to be a bit of a bigger push there going on. But there's also more insidious forms of creep as well. These kind of things where even the technology itself starts to cast a very long shadow in what it's doing, and the control and the direction of that shadow, the shape of it itself, is kind of controlled by aspects of the state and also by links with the private sector too. So the most recent one in the UK was the porn filter that was brought in, or what was advocated to be brought in by our Prime Minister earlier this year. This idea that there would be this opt-in that came from ISPs, that if you wanted to look at anything that was, pornographic, you would actually have to say, yes, I stand here and I would like to look at dirty pictures, thank you very much. And that would be brilliant. There's been a lot of furore around this for various obvious reasons in terms of workability. But one of many interesting aspects of it was when people started to dig a little more and looking down at what actually was going to be on that list of things to opt into. It wasn't just pornography. It was things like what was broadly termed as extremist and terrorist sites. There were kind of suicide sites. There were kind of web forums might have been on the list, and the fantastically ambiguous esoteric content, which could be defined as anything really. But that was the kind of the controls that were being placed in. But there's, again, even the way that states can build technology can kind of not only have its own biases, but the biases of history built into it as well, and particularly the myth-making around, entrepreneurship and startups and what should be done and how technology should be built and what works. We've talked this conference a fair amount about kind of the NSA and surveillance, and there's been mention of X-Keystore, which is one of the surveillance technologies that was specifically developed by the NSA to allow analysts to search metadata, to look through emails, to look through browsers, they could do searches by email addresses, by IP addresses, by names, a very sharp bit of technology, and possibly not, a particularly consensual one itself, but, that was the technology. And of all the things that I kind of found were completely fascinating about the way that it got built was the language that the NSA used to describe it. They described how they had built this in-house with a little startup-style team to do it. They had made sure that the developers and the customer support people and the support staff were working close to each other, so they'd be able to kind of work together on this. They described how they used agile techniques to achieve this, to achieve their surveillance technologies. They described how they worked closely with the customer to deliver, what was needed, remembering that the customer is, at this stage, the NSA. And most importantly, of course, they shipped code early and they shipped it often. At the end of City of Thieves, if you've done it in one of many right ways, you will come face-to-face with Sam Babone, who, in his own little way, is a tiny bit like the NSA. As you're kind of climbing up the Black Tower at the very end, he calls to you and says, "Aha, foolish adventurer, I can see you, but you can't see me." Which, raises questions about the kind of surveillance techniques in place around Silverton and Port Black Sand. But you go in, you're a hero, you kill him, that's great, you've done your job, you go back to the very rich merchants who were very fattened and well-fed, and they give you coins, and I think they give you a really nice sword, and it's brilliant, and that's the end of your adventure. And, you are the hero. The hero has come through. Except when we look back, there are some questions, really, that needed to be asked here. Firstly, what has seemed to be an adventurous quest has actually been very controlled from the outside. There are choices you've made, generally along the lines of, do I go left down Candle Street? Do I go right down East Street? Do I steal this brooch from this lizard? There are things that it's a question. There are things that you learn along the way, and not just if you've got your hands in the book like that, but you kind of figure out where the various routes are. You might draw a map itself. There is an element of luck and chance in the dice itself, but ultimately this is a story that's been set up by someone else. This isn't, Sam Babone pulling the strings from behind the scenes going, ha, 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 if they go that way, they will find the table with the scorpion brooches. This has been set up by a bigger system. Secondly, if you've got to this end successfully and you've done everything you need to do in order to finish, you will have, admittedly you'll have things like your hank of hag's hair, you'll have your black pearls, you'll have your lotus flowers. These things destroy Sam Babone. You'll have the silver arrow you need to kind of knock him down as well. You will have killed or at least maimed, it's never quite clear in fighting fantasy, an awful lot of people to get to that point. There's not really a path that is kind of, you skipping around merrily and no one touches you, and it's brilliant, the end. There is generally somewhere along the line people sometimes going about their own business. And to get to Sam Babone, generally, in some iterations, you will have seriously wounded a lot of men and women. You will have punched probably a centipede somewhere down the line. There are some giant rats you will have taken out, and a lizardine. Most of the creatures, like you saw in the previous slide, are not here anymore because of you. But it's okay, you've won. But more than that, one of the things you need to do to get past him is to have on your forehead a tattoo of a white unicorn in a yellow sun. And there you are, marching around like some kind of terrible hipster with this thing on your face. And you've won, brilliant. But you are transformed. You are transformed by what has happened. There's a way to describe the way that technologies come into the world by Frank Yields, and he calls them hopeful monsters. The technology comes into the world, hopefully, because it wants to change the world, but it's a monster, because actually it's not familiar and it's not right for the world it's in. And one of the things from policy making and from fighting fantasy is the monsters are not born that way. Technologies are made monstrous by the processes they have to go through, the ways that they get skewed, the people who are allowed to make them, the paths of funding, the places where government approves or doesn't approve of them, the locations they're adopted into. There is a skewing and messing way where the larger political and economic and cultural and social systems create this monstrous being that emerges into the world. And it's not the monster at the end of the game, it's the game itself. Thank you very much.